I just put together my most valuable learnings, lessons, and failures from 2024, and I did it, one, so that I could document them for myself to ensure that I don't make them in the future, and two, I thought you might get some value. This is the first year I've done this, and I've only had the podcast for a year, and so we'll see how it goes, and if I want to do it again next year. Who am I, and what are these lessons that I speak of? Well, I'm a 13 and a half year Fortune 30 corporate America veteran, and I left that atmosphere and went all in on entrepreneurship in 2021. And so we are 4 years in to being a full-time entrepreneur. My business's income progression has looked like this. Year one, 58,000. Year two, 358,000. Year three, 628,000. In this past year, we did just under 1.2 million. So my first seven-figure year as an entrepreneur. And my team has stayed small. We've kept it under 5 full-time employees the entire time, and we are currently at 2 employees plus myself full-time. And I share what I can about the game of business in the event that it's helpful for all of you and to document it for myself. So, my first piece of advice is focus can be the single greatest lever that you can pull to grow your business. Earlier this year, I made the decision to shut down one of my markets and focus exclusively on one. For those of you that are new to the channel, I run a real estate business, and I was running that business in 2 different markets that were 500 miles apart from each other. Now, before I go into this, I want to be clear that it was advantageous for me to shut down a market because I was still new. And I launched a second market very early in my career. I was still learning the game of business. And I think it's likely down the road I do launch another market. But in the beginning, I think it was important I focused in order to learn. When I was in both markets, I found myself having to figure out what marketing was working in 2 different markets. I had to manage 2 different sets of contractors, 2 different sets of buyers, 2 different sets of realtors. And because I was brand new to the business, I had a marketing skill gap. I had a sales skill gap. I had a leadership skill gap, which is ironic, given that's what I did in my previous world. And I'll get to that on a little bit later. So I was actively trying to improve my skills in all areas of business. And I was doing so while diverting my attention to completely 2 different markets in the US that, again, were 500 miles from each other. And to be clear, my business is direct to seller real estate, meaning I run marketing. Sellers who want to sell their houses, they call our company and we buy their house, or we figure out how they can get their house sold. If I was only flipping, for example, and I wasn't direct to seller, I wasn't running marketing and taking sales calls, I was just buying, for example, off the MLS and flipping houses off the MLS, the main skill there is construction management. And I do think that's a little bit different because I can focus on one skill and just do it in a couple different areas. And there are different sets of complexities that come with that. You have to manage 2 different sets of realtors and contractors and so on and so forth. But overall, the business itself is the construction business. And so I do think that's a little bit different. But back to my business. When I decided to go down to one market, I found myself talking more and more to the same people, right? The same realtors, the same contractors, the same buyers, etc. And I got to focus on honing my skills versus constantly feeling like I was putting out fires. I got to increase my marketing budget in one market versus having a marginal marketing budget split between 2 different markets. And when I did this, everything in my business improved, including, most importantly, my ability to serve the local client base, which in turn improved our ability to generate a profit. And I had my most profitable year since being in business. Now, it wasn't just my focus from 1 to 2 markets that helped me. There were 2 other very important pieces to the focus that I want to touch on. One, I said no to any and all other business, quote, opportunities, right? These are people wanting to meet, in-person masterminds where I'd go, 3 to 4 days during a week, regular local masterminds, people wanting to do lunch, coffee, or other opportunities to do business, quote, together with someone else, right? Anything that was not what I knew that I needed to do, which was right in front of me, I said no to. And that was a big element of focus for me. And the thing is, when I said no, in the short term, it appeared like, no big deal when these opportunities presented themselves to me, right? If I do a launch, it wouldn't be hugely disruptive. If I go to a mastermind, it's just a few days. The problem is, I said no so many times that my collective time on task, which was my task was growing my business, was exponential than had I done all those things. So the problem of saying yes here and there is over time it adds up. And if you take all of the collective time that I would have spent away from the business, it would have been exponential and it would have been detrimental to the business. And the reason too is not just because of the raw time that I gained by saying no to all of these other things. It also just helped me stay focused on individual projects or individual tasks or individual initiatives that we were moving forward in our business. And it helped me stay focused on them for longer consecutive periods of time, which reduced the time that I needed to get back in a flow state to work on a certain initiative. And for example, like if you take a trip and you come back on, say, like a Wednesday night, and then you go back to work on Thursday, you're playing catch up from the week. And then on Friday, you might as well, focus on other things that might last or you might be able to complete in one day, as opposed to starting to push forward a larger initiative or pick up a larger initiative from last week, like just finish this week's work and then start fresh on Monday, right? Well, because I didn't take these trips that might last 2 or 3 days and I come back midweek, that never happened. I was able to start an initiative or start a project and continue to move it forward until I was complete with it, which was very helpful. And so there is the raw time gained, of course, but then there's also just the amount of consecutive time spent improving myself, improving the business, which was really, really helpful. And the second very impactful piece of focus that I want to touch on is focus in my personal life. We didn't take a big family vacation. We didn't travel to hang out with a lot of friends. We said no to a lot of requests to get together. And now, there was one trip. My wife and I were married 10 years this year. We did take a few days to go to a really cool Airbnb. But outside of that, we really didn't do many extracurricular activities. I worked just about every single weekend. And we generally said no to everything that wasn't moving us closer to our goals this year. And I want to be very clear here. I am not saying that you shouldn't hang out with any of your friends or not take any trips, not take any vacations. I'm just saying that for me, and my wife and I agreed on this, we were in, and we still are in, a very particular season in our lives. And it helped us to get closer to our goals because we stayed committed to the season that we're in. Next up is enduring hard times creates the most valuable skills. And let me explain what I mean here. When you endure hard times, and enduring hard times means that you are absolutely refusing to give up, it quite literally means that to endure, you have to get better. You have to improve. And what's interesting is that if the times you're going through are really, really difficult, you acquire so many skills during that period. And you have to acquire them to continue to move forward. And when you get to the end of whatever hardship that you're going through, you come out of the other side very chiseled, very worked on. And you're so chiseled, or you're so developed that compared to everyone else, you now have skills that 99% of other people do not have. And as a result of that, the marketplace perceives your skill set to be very valuable because there's just simply a very low supply of human beings who have the skill set you do. And that's why I think that enduring hard times creates extreme value, because you build skill sets that are uncommon. And that, frankly, is part of why I think the best entrepreneurs win. They simply have endured incredibly hard times that have forced them to get this incredible skill set. And now nobody can take that away from them, right? They can maneuver the marketplace at their disposal because they have learned these very, very valuable skills. And I think this is why you read about a lot of rich people who lose everything and then are able to get it back what feels like almost instantly. All right. If what they build goes to zero, the one thing that will never go to zero, barring, of course, some sort of traumatic head injury, is the skills that they have learned. And it's the skills they've learned that make them rich. It's not the one business that ends up getting there, right? That one business was built on the foundation of all of the previous failures and all of the previous skills and all of the previous hard times that they've gotten through. And because of those hard times that created the strong leader of that business, that is what has now made that business successful, which has made the owner rich. And here's the thing. I believe that in business, hard times never go away, right? You just become more skilled to deal with those hard times. And the hard times that you once perceived as, oh my gosh, this is incredibly challenging, just now feels like, oh yeah, this is par for the course, right? So your bar or your expectation of perceived hardship just completely changes after you go through something that's really difficult. And in business, that's important because the difficulty of business never goes away. There are always new problems to solve. There's always these different things being thrown at you, and it's just always difficult. So business is not about avoiding the hard times. It's about developing the skill set necessary to be able to navigate the hard times appropriately, not drive yourself or your team crazy, and to survive and continue playing the game of business. And I think something very important for people to understand is enduring the hard time itself, that in and of itself is a skill. It's something that can be learned, and it can be learned by anyone, and I truly believe this. And it's the people who endure the hardest times, they don't have these superhuman emotional genetics or this superhuman willpower. They simply have chosen they're either going to die or they're just going to keep going, right? And the skill of enduring involves all these little micro skills, the most impactful being the skill of simply focusing on improvement, all right? Because here's the thing. If you are going through a very difficult time and you say to yourself, well, yeah, this really sucks, it is very difficult. However, the only thing that I'm going to divert or focus any and all of my attention on is how that I can be better than I was yesterday. I'm going to figure that out, and I'm going to figure out what the one thing is that will get me closer to where the business needs to go, and I will relentlessly work to improve that skill that will help enable me get the business to where I need to go. And that ultimately is what is going to be my focus, right? Because if your focus is on improving, then that means you are not focused on how hard it is or, woe is me, whatever the case may be in hardship, whatever makes people quit during hardship. You are not focusing your attention on that. You are only focused on improving. You can just consistently work to get better and better. And it's this interesting way of having patience to endure the hard thing that you're going through. And it's hard, but in the midst of it being hard, you just focus on improving. And then when you get better, you get yourself out of that difficult time. I think a lot of people quit because all they do is complain about how hard it is. And granted, it is hard. And nobody is taking that from them, right? What people go through and the hardships they go through in business, they're very, very difficult. But when you focus on what to do rather than how hard it is, then every day, all you have to do is put your foot in front of the next long enough until you actually walk yourself out of the issue. Albert Ellis wrote a really great book on how our thinking impacts our feelings and therefore impacts our actions. It's called A Guide to Rational Living. Would suggest it if you're interested in the topic or if that's something that you're working on. And he talks about exactly this, how so many people, they stay in misery or they quit because all they do is they focus their attention and they focus their thinking on how hard the thing is, how much it sucks, how because the thing is hard and it's been hard for so long that it must mean that the person sucks. All right. And if that is something that you're struggling with, then again, that book might be a great resource. And speaking of improvement, the one thing I did earlier this year that helped me improve my business the most. I started a new morning routine. Are you ready to hear this? It is literally groundbreaking. It's groundbreaking. I wake up and I get to work. And that's the routine. Here's what I was doing before that. Before I woke up, I would meditate for 10 to 15 minutes. I would then read a book for 30 minutes and I'd get in a pre-workout meal. This took about a half hour. Then I would go to the gym for 60 to 90 minutes. I came home, had a post-workout meal, I showered, and I got to work. And by the time I started work, it was about 9:30 and everyone else was awake. The amount of deep work I got done was close to zero. I always found myself working in the business rather than on it because the time I started working, everyone else was also working. And so it was very easy for my attention to be split in many different directions. Now I wake up between 4 and 5 a.m. and I get right to work. And from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m., I can work on business priorities without being distracted. I get close to an entire workday in before I actually start my workday, and that has helped push my business forward more than anything else. And what's really interesting, I've been less stressed, right? I actually have stopped meditating because I wake up and I get right to work. And I have no idea if the two are correlated, but the facts are I'm not meditating anymore and I am less stressed than I used to be. So it's like if I actually work on my problems and I actually spend time on the work that is going to solve the problems that create the stress, then I don't need to relieve the negative emotions associated with the stress by meditating, right? And I think too, I've also just learned to be okay with negative emotions and be okay with stress. So, I'm sure some of the need not to meditate stems from some of that as well. And, yes, I still work out regularly. I just shifted the time of my workouts to later in the afternoon. And I work out after I've essentially gotten 2 full work days in, right? So this is a routine that has gotten me very, very good results last year. And because of that, I am going to continue that routine of waking up and just getting right to work. And look, I'm not saying that in order for you to achieve success, that you got to wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. For example, one of the most successful people I know personally has spent most of his entrepreneurial life doing deep, focused work between, say, 7 p.m. and 2 a.m. And that's just what worked for him, right? The point is he consistently does that focused work, right? He would always work. He would just do it later at night and he would sleep much later and that's fine, right? So I don't think it matters as long as you do consistent focused work and you have time 4 to 6 hours a day where you can spend time in that deep work to move the big initiatives forward. That is almost impossible to do when you're navigating the ins and outs or when you're operating your business. Next up is your luck increases the more that you do. I did a few deals at the end of this year and they were banger deals, right? And they were back-to-back banger deals, so it felt extra cool. And there were dynamics about the deals that regardless of some of the details, they still would have been banger deals. But there were some, quote, lucky scenarios about some of the specifics. For example, I had this house I put in contract and I attempted to wholesale it just to a couple buyers and I didn't really get a response that I liked. And it was around that time where I wanted to experiment with something a little bit new. I wanted to buy it, just clean it out, take professional photos, and then list it on the open market, right? So it's almost like instead of dispoing it off market, dispoing just means I am finding a disposition for the house or I am finding another buyer for the house, right? And instead of trying to do that off market, then what would happen if I just listed it for sale and then sold it? I had this theory that because housing inventory was so tight that if I listed the house at a very aggressive price, and not just aggressive for the condition, but also aggressive for the area and the condition that it was in, it would drive significant demand. That was my theory. And due to interest rates, less people could afford a bigger house or a more expensive house. And so by me trying to list the house at the lowest possible price, increased the amount of buyers who would actually buy the house. And so was my theory that I wanted to test. Well, when I listed this house, it got crazy demand and we got 1 million offers. Okay, we got over 10 offers on one house over one weekend. There were almost 40 showings in 3 days. So there was a lot of activity. And this was late fall. And at the last minute, and when I say last minute, I essentially assigned a deadline. I said, hey, we're going to review all offers at this time. Well, right before that time, we got an offer that was $20,000 more than the next best offer. Now, had I not gotten that offer, it still would have been a banger deal, but this offer made it the most banger deal, right? And so the point is, did I get lucky with that extra 20 grand? Or because I was willing to try new things, take significant action, did that increase the probability that the quote luck found me, right? And I think this is a really important concept to understand about the most successful people, because I do think a lot of them are perceived as lucky. People look at people's rocky cutscene, right? And then they call them lucky. But what they don't look at is all the work that it went to get to that rocky cutscene, all the exposure they gave themselves by putting themselves in front of an opportunity, and then another opportunity, and then another, and then another, and then another, right? That exposed them further to the probability of finding luck. And, you know, if you sat with a coin, for example, that had a heads and a tails, if you tried long enough, then you're going to flip that coin to a heads 6 times in a row, right? And people don't see how many times that you have flipped the coin to try and get to that 6 times in a row. They don't see all of the effort and all the work to get there, right? They don't know how many times that you've done it. But what they do see is that you do it. And because you do it, and there's only, you know, what is that, a 1.5% chance of that happening, because it occurred at a probability of 1.5%, you get called lucky, right? And so not only does luck increase with the action that you take, but I truly believe that volume negates luck, right? And see, I learned this the hard way this year. We got really busy and I needed to hire for a certain role. And I put together this job description. I put the role out there and maybe we got like 10 applicants, right? I ended up interviewing 5 people and I ended up making the decision to hire one. Even though my confidence in that hire was, it was like a 6 to a 7 out of 10. And before I made the hire, I even had a conversation with my assistant and I said, I feel like this, if this person is going to work out, then we're going to get really lucky, because we literally barely did any interviews. And guess what? The person didn't work out. Now, if I had interviewed 100 people, would getting the right person have been lucky? Right? Some might see the perfect fit afterwards and say, oh my gosh, you're so lucky that to have Sally on your team. She's absolutely amazing. And then you think, yeah, you know, so lucky. It definitely wasn't the 100 interviews that I did and the dozens and dozens of hours I spent interviewing and the dozens of hours I spent on my armboarding and my training, right? Like, people don't see all of that. They just see this amazing person on your team and they say, wow, you're so lucky. Right? And so when you do volume of anything, then I think over a long enough period of time, luck is a non-factor, because your volume is what ends up producing your luck. And I'm annoyed that I had to learn this the hard way in the reverse. In other words, I didn't even produce the environment that might give me the opportunity or the probability for some luck, because I barely interviewed anyone, and because of that, the person left. All right, and it was a good lesson. It's a lesson that I won't make again. And this is a good segue into my next learning. The best way I have found to learn is to do tons of volume. And then you look back at the volume that you have done and you see what did and didn't work. And then you change your behavior based on what you find. And then you repeat this until you become extremely skilled at whatever it is that you're doing volume of. And this took me way too long to learn. And part of the reason I think it took me a long time to learn is because in my previous W-2 environment, it was a lot more common to be punished for doing things that didn't work, All right, there was more of an expectation closer to perfection. Maybe it's something I made up in my head. I don't know. But my strategy used to be analyze the shit out of a potential strategic initiative, talk to a million people, get tons of feedback, prepare SOBs, roll out communication, make sure it's going to be perfect, make sure you know exactly what's going to happen when you roll it out, and then execute the rollout. Right? And what I've learned in entrepreneurship is having that mentality is actually going to kill your business, because you're going to move at a snail's pace and you're never actually going to get anything done. The best businesses act quickly. They do a shit ton of volume. They look back at that volume to see what worked. They make adjustments, and then they just keep going. And over time, if you do that enough, then you're going to get so good. And the reason you get good is not because of the time you spent to make it perfect, but rather the time you spent perfecting it after and while doing the thing. And I think there's a big difference. And you will be differentiated in your market if you learn that way. So whatever you're doing, do a ton of volume, look at what works, and then make those adjustments. The next piece of advice I'll give is adapt and do so quickly. Earlier this year, there was all of this chatter in the investing community about wholesaling in Virginia being illegal for people without a real estate license. This happened in, I think, one state before, and then there was, I think, South Carolina has completely outlawed wholesaling altogether. But there was this new law in Virginia that was being passed, and in order to talk about real estate contracts, negotiate real estate contracts, and to assign contracts, the new law was going to be that you have to hold a real estate license. And every investor and their mother was talking about it. What are we going to do? It's going to be so impactful. What's going to happen? How is it going to be enforced, etc.? And I looked at the issue. I talked to a few people close to me, and I just decided that I was going to get my license. And I did this when all of the background noise, everyone was talking about it. I did it when all of that was at its peak. And then I spent 2 consecutive weeks studying to pass the real estate exam. At the end of the 2 weeks, I took the test and I was licensed. Right? So from decision to license, it was maybe 3 weeks. And that was it. And because I got my license, I was able to do a few creative deals this year that I wouldn't have been able to do without the license. And the reason is because they involved listings. And not only did I learn some new things, but we made the business some really good money in those deals. And I think of this like this specific example. You know, I think of adapting like a lot of businesses, what they had to go through during COVID. Think about restaurants, gyms, retail stores. The amount of business owners that I read about who were up in arms about how unfair it was that they had to be closed and life sucks and I'm going to shut down my doors because they refused to do something different. And instead of accepting the environment, they just said, well, this environment is bullshit. And then therefore they quit. But the best businesses, the best restaurants, the best gyms, they shifted their business to takeout only, right? For restaurants, they figured out how to deliver margaritas, right? Gyms sign people up for virtual personal training, et cetera, et cetera. And the business owners who did this quickly, you know, they didn't know how long COVID was going to last. They made this significant strategic shift, and as a result of them doing this, they were able to survive. And not only that, but they likely learned these new skills that they carried forward after COVID that enabled their business to generate even more income. And here's the thing, during all of that, you know, the pushback that I have heard that those business owners took was, well, what if we make all of these huge, enormous strategic shifts in our business and then the ban is lifted and then we have to go back, right? And it's like, what I've heard those business owners said was, well, so what? Then we go back. And the worst case scenario is we have more skills, right? And that's kind of exactly how I saw this wholesaling law. There wasn't a ton of downside outside of me spending time learning a new skill set. And then now I have my license, right? And the people I talked to who were in the I'm not going to get licensed camp, they would say things like, well, how are they going to enforce it? There's no way they can enforce it. What if we just double close? What if they make the law, figure it out, and they can't enforce it, and then the law just goes away? And okay, all of those problems exist, but so what? Then if the landscape continues to change, then I too will continue to shift, and I too will continue to adapt. And the amount of people I know, even today, who are still resisting that change is insane, right? And in that environment, there's not a ton of ramifications out there for people who are still wholesaling. But at some point, I'm sure something will happen, and I don't need to worry about it because I just made the decision. I spent 2 weeks to study, get my license, and I've just been going about my business as normal, right? It's not something I'm going to have to continue to think about. And as a result of that, I brought in some new opportunities this year that would not have been brought in had I not done that, right? Another example, I can now legally get a retail referral in my business because for you to, and what I mean by a referral, let's say a prospect calls in, they're not a good fit, and I send them to another real estate agent who lists their house and gets it sold, right? I wouldn't be able to get any referral income from that because I'm not licensed. Now, what a lot of investors do who are not licensed is they will try this crazy workaround. But again, if they get caught, I just don't want to deal with that. Why deal with it? Just do things the right way. Now, because I'm licensed, I have another opportunity to earn additional income and do absolutely nothing in additional time, right? So the point is, in business, things are always going to change. Stuff is always going to happen. New obstacles will present themselves. And in my mind, it's the business owners who choose to adapt and take action quickly who are going to be most poised to win. And that is where I want to be. Next up is in real life versus virtual. I've hired real estate coaches that say, you don't need to do in-person appointments. It's a huge waste of time. If you're doing them, you're missing out on sales due to volume and time spent driving back and forth to the house. If you drive a half hour there, half hour back, that's an hour in the car alone. And then I've had other real estate coaches say, well, in-person appointments will always beat virtual appointments. You should absolutely be doing in-person appointment. And here's the thing. I think they're both right. And what I found is that it's not a binary of you are doing all of one or all of the other. There are leads that can be closed virtually, and then there are leads who seem to need a bit more of a personal touch. And when we observe that personal touch is needed, then we adjust our strategy and we can go to the prospect in person and we can still win. And I think this is the same for employees too. I have virtual employees right now. And I know people who say, if you don't have an in-person office, you will lose. And I know people say, if you're not hiring virtual assistants, you're missing out on profit opportunities, right? And again, I think they're both right. There are just certain teams or certain roles that I think are very beneficial and have upside to be in person. And then there are some that aren't as relevant. And especially if you're newer to the business in real estate, you can build a virtual team in the beginning, and then as your team and as your business grows, you can start to build a more in-person type of environment. And as I continue to hire more and more people to continue to build my business, I am going to keep in mind that in real life versus virtual, it's not a binary, right? There are appropriate scenarios for both of them. Next is staying disciplined and not reacting to excitement or how excited you feel is what will prevent you from losing money on a real estate deal. 2024 was the first year where I didn't lose money on a property I bought in that year. Now, I lost plenty of money on deals in 2024, but they were not deals that I bought in 2024. And there was this one specific deal that was particularly intriguing. And I was disciplined enough to say no, and I ended up not doing the deal. And as a result, I know that I avoided losing money because I talked to the person who ended up doing the deal, and that person lost money. And the deals that I've lost the most amount of money on, I feel this level of excitement. Like, oh, this is a really cool house, or man, I really just want to do a deal. And I justified my emotion, I justified my excitement with some sort of logic that I went out and I found and I fabricated to support the decision to do the deal. Like maybe I went and I found a realtor who also told me that it was a great deal. And, see, Ryan, there's all the proof that you need. This realtor, they know the area really, really well. They say, it's going to sell for this much and therefore it's a killer deal. Well, I think what I stayed disciplined to this year is all of my purchase decisions were driven by hard data. And I corroborated that data with many different people and many different sources of data. But every deal I did those deals because the numbers were good on paper after I collected all of the data. And if that wasn't the case, then I did not do the deal. And I think generally this is a good lesson. Whether it's real estate or something else, your emotion is typically not a good indicator of the level of success of any deal, right? In fact, there seems to be an inverse correlation. The more excited you are, the higher probability to lose, because your excitement gives you blinders on all of the possible downside that may and eventually will occur. So good deals are good on paper, whether you're excited about them or not. And so if there is a deal that is making you excited, sleep on it. And when you wake up and you are not excited, if you still want to do the deal, then that may be a good indicator that it is a good deal. Success is on the other side of hard conversations. This was a really tough lesson for me this year. And I get pissed when I have to learn lessons more than once. And this is one that I did need to learn again. What took me so long to shut down my other market, and when I say what took me so long, I ran that market for, I guess about 2 years. Or maybe, it was I know it was about 2.5 years. And I knew as things were winding down that it was going to be wise for me to at least consider shutting down that market. And the reason it took me so long is because I went balls to the wall in that market when I first was building, and I hired a full-time employee out there. And I was so grateful for this employee. I brought him on in a period of absolute chaos. There were like 25 projects. They were all $100,000 plus remodels, and he came on. He was so committed to me. He was so committed to our team to help us get through the chaos. He was willing to do whatever was needed. He always kept a great attitude. He respected me. He was he's a generally nice human being. And I absolutely dreaded the idea of having the conversation with him about shutting that market down and how it might impact him. And in fact, week after week, as we got closer to me actually shutting that market down, I would come up with these emotional reasons of why it made good business sense for him to stay. And I found these little random things for him to do. And there were some days that would go by where I purposefully didn't ask what he was doing because I was terrified that I wouldn't be happy with his answer. And so I just avoided the conversation altogether. It was very stupid from a business owner standpoint. And then one day I realized that I was procrastinating something that I knew would eventually make our business better. I knew it would make me a better leader, and I knew in the long run it would actually be better for him and his family, because I knew down deep I was going to have to shut down that market. And I had already cut marketing spend there, so there was already less volume. So by further delaying having this conversation with him, I was doing him a disservice because I'm extending his own uncertainty about what's happening next. I'm delaying him, getting him somewhere that is going to serve him and his family better and might give him more longevity. So I finally had this conversation, which, by the way, if you want a hack to have a really difficult conversation, prep the shit out of that conversation. I put in hours and hours of prep into a 60-minute conversation, and it probably went as well as it possibly could have. It was such a great conversation. It ended in smiles. It ended in appreciation. It was just genuinely a great conversation, and I attribute that to how much that I prepared. And so if you are feeling very anxious or procrastinating a difficult conversation, do a lot of prep, and it could help give you the confidence you need to have it. And it could also impact the actual outcome of the conversation itself. And yeah, again, when the conversation was over, he was happy, I was happy, I got to move on to improve my business, and we cut significant expense. I mean, I paid him good money. And I was able to redirect that good money elsewhere, and that money that I redirected elsewhere helped generate additional income for the business. And so I will repeat this to myself into oblivion. Success is on the other side of hard conversations. Next up is relationships. And the first thing I learned this year about relationships is fewer relationships yield the highest returns. I very deliberately spent time with fewer and fewer people this year. The overwhelming criteria I use to spend time with someone is 1, will this person get me closer to my goals? And 2, will this person actively support me getting closer to my goals? And if the answer to either of those was a no, then I just simply didn't spend time with the person. And this helped me in a lot of different ways. 1, I spent less time, quote, hanging out, so I got more work done. If I'm hanging out with less people, then I am generally hanging out less, and therefore when I am not hanging out, I can work. So, added bonus in that sense. And 2, if the only people I spent time with were those that are going to help me get closer to my goals, what is the likelihood that at the end of the year, I am now closer to my goals? The likelihood is significantly higher than if I was hanging out with a bunch of people who are not getting me closer. And I really enjoyed this strategy this year. I don't think I ever truly accounted for how soul-sucking that it can be to spend time around people who are moving you no closer to where it is that you want to be. But that's what it is. It's truly soul-sucking. And it can be tough, right? The person, they might seem cool, or they might be perceived in a certain way in your friend group, or they might be, quote, fun. All right. But if they're not moving you closer to where you want to be, I've just found very little utility for people like that in my life. And the worst people to hang out with are people who are actively against you getting closer to your goals. Those people who say, oh, you shouldn't do that, or you should do this. And those things that they're shoulding all over you are in conflict with the actions that you need to take to get closer to your goals. And what's great, too, about people in this category of, to be clear, in the category of getting you closer to your goals, it's not always the people who give you the warm and fuzzies that are going to help you move closer to where you want to be, right? They're the people who are going to help you confront your own bullshit, because they know exactly what you want. They know the goals that you want to accomplish, and they give you the feedback that you need to actually get you closer to your goals, versus either no feedback at all or feedback that a person thinks that you may want to hear. And the circle of people I desire to spend time with is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And so what this means is that another thing I learned this year is the best way to increase the likelihood of a long-term relationship is to continue to filter the criteria of that relationship. And I'll explain what I mean. And this happened actually twice this year. There were 2 separate contractors I started to work with, and I really enjoyed them as humans. They were really nice. They were funny. They did decent contracting work. And I did things like have lunch with them, do dinners with them and their wife. And it was almost like I was trying to befriend them. And what I've come to realize is how I feel about an individual is not necessarily a good predictor for success of that relationship. The best predictor is to go back to what we just talked about. Is this person going to get me closer to my goals? And that might mean there might be relationships you build that help you achieve your business goals. And those relationships are a little bit more transactional, but it doesn't mean that just because someone is getting you closer to your business goals that it now means they deserve to be in your inner personal circle and spend a whole bunch of time with them. And so one thing I'm going to work very hard at this year is to maintain a very high bar, a very exceptional criteria for the people I am consistently spending a lot of time with. Next up, and this one is specific to the real estate industry, but I think applies to other businesses as well. Honesty will always prevail, and it especially prevails in an industry where it's less common. And what I mean is, in the direct-to-seller real estate industry, it is filled with all types of different people. What I've observed, both from personal observation as well as our own client feedback, is that there are many direct-to-seller real estate business owners who prioritize themselves over the client and then try to make the seller believe that they have the seller's best interest at heart, when in all reality they are not concerned about that at all. And frankly, some of them don't care so much that they make it very evident to the seller that they don't have the seller's best interest in mind. And I actually just did an entire podcast episode on this. And if you want to hear more about that, it's called "This One Thing Will Make You More Money." But if you're in direct-to-seller real estate and you can figure out how to actually operate in the seller's best interest, and you demonstrate this by what you say to them, you will start to develop a positive brand. You're going to feel better about the actions you take. You can lay your head on your pillow at night and sleep soundly, even though many people seem to do that with no issues and not having integrity. But, neither here nor there. But when you build a brand, you can actually start building a business that will have longevity. And, what I've learned about direct-to-seller real estate, most direct-to-seller real estate businesses will die if they turn off marketing, because they don't get clients from any other source other than direct response marketing, right? There is no brand. Or if there is a brand, it has a negative affiliation. And if you can build a brand in this business and you can get clients because of that brand, then you will automatically be better than about 95% of all of the other businesses in this industry. And I say that purely because you will have a client acquisition channel that 95% of other direct-to-seller real estate businesses do not, which is an acquisition channel that endures if there is no marketing. And so if you work hard to build a great product or service and are honest about the service and truly have your prospect's best interest in mind, imagine that. It's going to increase the likelihood of your clients telling other people how great their experience with you was, and that has a greater probability of making you and your business better. Next up is a leadership lesson. And that lesson is that a reward-based culture will far outpace a punishment-based culture. This one for me is a bit ironic and even a bit personal. And the reason being, for those of you who don't know the details of my background, I spent 13 and a half years in various leadership roles in my previous W-2 life. That's essentially the one skill set that I honed most, or maybe better said, it was the one skill set that I had the opportunity to hone most. And I'm not very happy that it took me this long to learn this lesson, but I think the reason it took so long is because I got pretty decent results. I got promoted several times and made good money. I got a lot of reinforcement in the behaviors that I was executing. And for the record, I don't think it's not that I enjoyed punishment-based leadership or I enjoyed punishing others or that I even deliberately punished them. I think it's just the fact that I lacked the skill set of knowing how to get people to do things in a reward-based culture versus punishing them when they didn't do the thing that I needed or I wanted them to do. And it was simply a skill gap. And one big turning point for me was when I read Patrick Lencioni's book, The Motive. Very good book. If this topic resonates with you at all, I would suggest you go read it. But my biggest takeaway from that book was that getting promoted to a leadership role was a dire responsibility. And that responsibility is to serve the people that you are leading. Getting promoted into a leadership role is not some sort of personal accolade for doing a good job. All right? Getting promoted isn't a symbol of status because you moved up. In fact, it was almost the opposite. The more you move up, and the more your skills, or the lack thereof, if you don't have them, are put on blast for everyone to see, because if you continue to get promoted, you're in more in visible roles. And the larger the weight on your shoulder, the more you move up to truly be in service of your team, right? That's the true definition of a leader. And in the book, the author tells a story about a guy, and he goes through this whole leadership journey, and I was the guy in that book. And once I read it and I did some other reflecting, I made it my mission that I would no longer be that type of leader. I was no longer going to accept not having the skills that I needed to lead more effectively. I studied the heck out of the topic. I changed my behavior, and by no means am I John Wooden now. I still have a long ways to go. That is going to be a primary focus for me to continue to hone that skill this year. But the effort that I have put into improving that skill set, I think, has paid off and has changed the way that I lead people. And so if you are finding that you're struggling to get people to do things over an extended period of time, then you may just have a skill gap, and you may just need to study the topic a little bit, make some adjustments, try different things, and work to improve. And I do believe this is probably the skill set that will get me the highest returns in business, because if I'm truly a skilled leader, if I'm an exceptional leader, there's not really any other skills in business that I need to be exceptional at, right? Because me being an exceptional leader is going to attract the people who are highly skilled at all of the other things that are needed in business. And that is an area that I will continue to double down on and continue to work on to improve. To close out here, my final piece of advice is to continue to pay for education. I have seen outsized returns this year on paying people for knowledge that I don't currently have, or paying people to look at what I'm doing, give me feedback, and that way I can adjust. And the whole idea of shutting down one of my markets, for example, came from a coach that I hired earlier this year, came from a mentor. I had considered it on my own, but after walking him through my business, he was like, dude, you got to shut down that market. And he made a lot more money than me at the time in the business, and so I listened. All right. And what do you know? That resulted in me making a lot more money. And another example, I recently paid two guys $1,000 an hour just for them to get on a Zoom call for me and answer questions I had. Right. And the perspective and or tactical advice, depending on which call I was on, that I got on each of those calls is going to make me tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And is that worth $1,000 for 1 hour of someone's time? I mean, holy shit, right? If that's all that person did, they would make $2 million a year. Like, yeah. And who cares? It's worth it, right? If you have access, or you can pay someone an egregious amount of money, but in return, you get that egregious amount of money times 3, times 4, times 10, times 100, then no matter what the price is, it's worth it. And my stance on education is you're going to have to pay for education with either time or money. Why would I not use money if I have the resource to pull the education from the future into the present as fast as I humanly possibly can? And that is something that I'm going to continue to do more of. And as I improve, I will probably start to spend more and more learning skills that I don't currently have by getting access to people who have those skills and paying them for that access. If you liked this, I would also recommend that you check me out on Instagram and TikTok. Follow me there. If you're not already, I've consistently been putting out content there on these little learnings. And while we go really deep in these podcasts, in TikTok and Instagram, they're more high volume, quick little hitters. And I'm usually basing it off of deals that I'm going or in the middle of or have just learned something from. And maybe they could give you some ideas that you didn't previously have. My Instagram is @TheRyanRice. TikTok is @TheRyanRice11. The first one was taken. And if this was valuable for you, it would mean the absolute world to me if you shared it. This is the first time I put out an entire year's worth of learnings into one episode. I put some time into it to put together some notes, thinking about what I've learned. And I will work harder and harder this year to bring you guys more valuable stuff and more of the lessons that I continue to learn. And the only real way that this podcast grows is if you share it. So put it on Instagram, tag me if you do, text it to a friend, maybe tap your thumb on the rating. All of the things would be helpful. Thank y'all and be good. Bye.